Hey everybody, and welcome back to Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Noah, and today we're going to be exploring a truly contentious topic, gifted and talented programming in New York City public schools. The divisiveness of the subject is rooted in two obligations for public education that are not inherently contradictory, but seem to be at odds with one another in the case of gifted education in the city. These obligations are, on the one hand, differentiation, to ensure that every child's unique needs are considered when preparing instruction, and equity. We are talking about public schools, after all, which are intended to serve every child, regardless of ability or access to test preparation. In this episode, we will consider the current state of gifted and talented programming in New York City. Spoiler alert, it is being phased out in favor of a new program called Brilliant NYC, much to the chagrin of many of the parents of children in gifted and talented programs. In order to understand how we arrived at this moment in the history of New York City public education, we will also consider the history behind gifted and talented programming in New York City public schools, which will take us all the way back to 1973. But first, a news report from Tuesday, October 12th.
Pretty strong blowback tonight on New York Mayor de Blasio's plan to eliminate the controversial Gifted and Talented program in city schools.
Yeah, many people are asking, rather than get rid of this program, why not get more students into it? Why penalize kids who need more of a challenge and instead challenge more students?
75% of students in the program are either Asian or Caucasian. That's been the controversy. Here's Eyewitness News reporter Lauren Glasper.
With only a few months left in office, the mayor today pushing ahead with his plan to end the Gifted and Talented program and replace it with what he calls Brilliant NYC.
We're getting rid of a lot of the artificial barriers that limited the number of kids who could get accelerated learning.
The new plan has students of all levels learning together with accelerated curriculum offered to those who need the extra challenge. It's unclear how those kids will be identified, but kindergarten teachers will be given extra training and teams would help schools implement accelerated curriculum options.
Our current GNT model serves 2,500 kindergartners a year. So with the expansion of accelerated learning to all 65,000 students, 26 times more students will benefit from this tailored instructional model in its first year alone.
Save our kids! Save our kids!
But today, a rally against the dismantling of the GNT program, one that works for parents like Chen Kwok. He's calling for more GNT schools throughout the city.
The GNT kids, you know where they're coming from? They're coming from the Bronx. They're coming from Brooklyn, from Queens. They're commuting 2 hours each way, and they're Black, Hispanic, Asian, white.
And he says it's irresponsible for the mayor to overhaul the system on his way out.
He's announcing a grand plan. He's not going to be around to take responsibility and be accountable for it. It's an experimental plan.
A plan that a new mayor could adopt or even reverse. Meanwhile, Mayor de Blasio asking for input from the community on the rollout and creation of this plan, a plan that not all families are on board with.
The really interesting thing about this video, which I will link in the episode description so that you can see it for yourself, is this group of parents that has assembled on the steps of a government building in Manhattan. It's about 24 seemingly polite and relatively quiet protesters holding signs that say stuff like "More GNT" and "Kids deserve a chance to excel, keep GNT." But then there's this one sign that's visible, if you look closely, in opposition to CRT, or critical race theory, which has been a buzzword recently in discussions of school curricula. It's not even a little bit related to GNT unless you consider some of the critiques of GNT programming related to school segregation. It really begs the question, if G&T programs are not intended to segregate student populations based on race and only on this colorblind concept of aptitude, then why bring up your opposition to CRT at a protest in favor of G&T? It's sort of a "sir, this is a Wendy's" situation. Like, we hadn't even had a chance yet to mention that this programming is racist, but now that you mention it, your opposition to CRT might be a little telling. There's also this one middle-aged white man leading a chant of "Save Our Kids" that the polite, quiet parents are sort of reluctantly joining into. It's funny because "Save Our Kids" or "Save the Children" became a rallying cry for QAnon believers after social media platforms started cracking down on misinformation in the form of QAnon posts. "Save the Children" was a sort of euphemism for, send the Satanist baby-eating cabal to Gitmo, which was a more specific articulation of the QAnon community's desires. So this guy, who is probably just some kid's dad, nonetheless really fits the description of 90% of the people at the Capitol riot, giving this scene the look of a parent protest being hijacked by a wild-eyed conspiracy theorist. Of course, there's only a few seconds of footage before it cuts to the reporter, so who knows if that's really what's going on, but I just love that image. Now, both sides of the gifted and talented debate have a philosophically sound argument. Parents of children in gifted and talented programs can make the case that their children require a particular form of curricular differentiation, just as all children need some sort of curricular differentiation. There is no such thing as a normal child. Like all children are different, require differentiation. On the other hand, those in opposition to the gifted and talented programs would point to the fact that all children require differentiation of one sort or another. So why segregate a school so that one form of differentiation needs is honored while the needs of the remaining students, those who are defaulted to neither gifted nor talented, are aggregated to a single learner experience? Philosophy is one thing, but the real question is, what is actually happening in the schools? How does the data look? So to try and answer this question, I reviewed some of the literature on the topic of gifted and talented education in New York City. Really, you have to look very hard to find a source that doesn't state in no uncertain terms that gifted and talented programming in New York City public schools is segregated along lines of race and class. The New York City student population is roughly 2/3 Black and Latinx, yet white and Asian students made up 3/4 of admissions to gifted and talented programs in New York, with only the remaining quarter of students being Black and Latinx in recent years. This is really the only figure anybody should need to see before deciding that something radical has to be done to reform or even abolish gifted and talented programming. Yet it has been a part of New York City public schools for nearly 50 years. A 1996 study by the New York City chapter of ACORN, which stands for the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, using paired racial teams patterned after a fair housing testing method, found that several community school districts offering gifted programs provided false information to prevent Black and Latinx parents from applying to the programs for their children while facilitating applications from white parents. For Black and Latinx students who managed to gain admission to gifted and talented programs against all of the odds stacked against them systematically, the difficulty is really only just beginning. This is from an article by Sewell and Goings entitled "Navigating the Gifted Bubble: Black Adults Reflecting on Their Transition Experiences in NYC Gifted Programs." because Black students are less likely to be recruited into gifted programs, those who do gain entrance tend to represent a numerical minority, sometimes as the only Black student in the class. This often leads to feelings of isolation and issues with stereotyping and microaggressions from classmates and teachers who doubt their abilities. This treatment, if not counteracted, can lead to the imposter syndrome, i.e., feeling that one does not belong or is not as intelligent and capable. Moreover, Black students may feel pressured to serve as racial ambassadors, meaning that their individual thoughts and actions function as a stand-in for the collective consciousness and agenda of the whole race. For some students, such high expectations encourage academic success, but others bend and break under the weight of such immense pressure, which results in low achievement, i.e., low grades, and underachievement, i.e., not meeting their potential. Ultimately, these social-emotional issues take their toll, sometimes resulting in Black students opting out of gifted classrooms altogether. Gifted and talented programs began in New York City in 1973 with a $60,000 gift from the Vincent Astor Foundation to begin a few gifted classes in Manhattan and Brooklyn. This is the same Astor family to which John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men in U.S. history, belonged. Just a little side note here, the neighborhood in which we record the show, Astoria, was named for John Jacob Astor in the 19th century in the hopes of convincing him to invest here, but he never visited. Anyway, the gifted programming was expanded over time into accelerated programs within normal schools as well as entire G&T schools. This year, there were roughly 2,400 spots available for kindergarten admissions to gifted and talented programs in the city. Admission to gifted and talented schools in New York has always been a contentious issue, with a well-established history of demonstrable systemic racism and cheating the system. But on its face, the goal was to measure aptitude among 4-year-olds to determine who stood the greatest chance of benefiting from accelerated curriculum. The entrance exam for 4-year-olds was actually 2 tests, the OLSAT and the NNAT. The Otis Lennon School Ability Test, or OLSAT, tested a child's verbal abilities. They had to pay close attention and listen carefully to oral instruction and complete tasks such as finding differences and similarities, remembering words and numbers, recognizing sequences, and doing basic arithmetic. There were 2 categories of verbal questions. The first category, verbal comprehension, measured one's ability to process information through listening to language. The second, verbal reasoning, measured one's ability to discover patterns and relationships and solve problems using language. The Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, or NNAT, tested a child's nonverbal abilities, how they reasoned without the use of spoken language. There were 4 kinds of questions on the NNAT. Pattern completion measured one's ability to recognize and insert missing pieces into patterns. Reasoning by analogy measured one's ability to recognize relationships among geometric shapes. Serial reasoning measured one's ability to recognize sequences among shapes, and spatial visualization tested one's ability to recognize how 2 shapes would look when combined. The NNAT is a Pearson test that replaced the Bracken School Readiness Assessment in preparation for the 2013 school year, when too many children were achieving perfect scores on the latter test. The idea with the NNAT was to make it more difficult to prepare for, and thus actually measure aptitude as opposed to test preparation. but parents of prospective gifted and talented children did their best to prepare for the test anyway, and test prep companies made a fortune off of materials and services designed to coach children for these tests. Keep in mind, we're talking about 4-year-olds here. Starting in 3rd grade, state tests stand in for measuring achievement in elementary students, and by 7th and 8th grade, there is the SHSAT for specialized high schools. Norm Fruchter wrote about how in the 1980s, parents would hire private psychologists to help prepare their children for the psychological test administered in their school district as part of gifted and talented programming. Even if parents were not wielding an unfathomable amount of time and financial resources to help their children prepare for the test or really to sort of cheat the idea behind the tests have always been more reflective of cultural bias and familial advantage than aptitude. It is of prime importance to determine what an assessment is actually assessing, and test after test seemed to measure children's level of familiarity with the reigning cultural milieu in which test makers and applicants alike were immersed. It was for that reason, and COVID safety protocols too, of course, that the tests were abolished for this year's rising kindergartners. The new system for 2021 to 2022, supposedly the final year of gifted and talented admissions before the program begins phasing out, began with a nomination from a parent or guardian. This is essentially the same thing as signing up for the test. A parent or guardian declares that they would like their child to be considered for the G&T program and lets the city know. 11,600 children were nominated in this way for the 2021 to 2022 school year. Following the nomination, a pre-K teacher, if the child is enrolled in pre-K, or an employee of the Department of Early Childhood Education, if they are not, evaluated the child to determine their eligibility. And about 10,000 made the cut at that point. So then the 10,000 children who were eligible for G&T programming entered a lottery system for the roughly 2,400 seats available in G&T programming for this year. If a test tends to show the bias of the system in which it is designed and implemented, a teacher will often show that same bias or even a personal bias. But the high pass rate in the new system would suggest that pre-K teachers and DOE employees were not interested in doing too much personal gatekeeping. The major gatekeeping step occurred with the lottery, which, provided it was not manipulated behind the scenes, is a fair way of distributing limited spots to too many applicants. It does reinforce, though, that there are many more students in the DOE who could benefit from accelerated curriculum than there are spots in the DOE's segregated gifted and talented program, which is a problem. One highlight worth considering, though, was how this year's application process resulted in a 42% increase in offers in the 19 districts with the largest shares of students from low-income families. Those are districts where the percentage of students who are economically disadvantaged exceed the city average of 73%. And that's really a number to keep in the back of your mind all the time, is that the city average of students who are economically disadvantaged is 73% of the student body. This was a big step in the direction of equity in the admission process. Interestingly enough, it was not the first time something like it was discussed for G&T programming in New York City. Norm Fruchter again writes about how parents responded when his community school board in Brooklyn discussed plans to begin G&T programming in first grade as opposed to kindergarten, thus making it possible to do admissions entirely based on referral instead of testing. Here's a quote from Norm. The school board disseminated our proposal district-wide, scheduled a special board meeting to discuss it, and invited the entire district parent community. The resulting attendees were almost entirely white, gifted parents, as they referred to themselves. These parents uniformly denounced our proposed policies as destructive of gifted students' needs. Heated arguments dismissed entry selection based on kindergarten teacher judgment as hopelessly subjective, as opposed to the supposedly objective scientific evidence our testing instruments provided. First grade entry was criticized as far too late to begin the task of shaping students' giftedness, and worse, would require many students to endure the privations of locally zoned kindergartens for an entire year. Here's another report, this one from Pix 11 News, in which we hear from more protesters about why they need gifted and talented programming. We also hear from counter-protesters making a perfectly valid argument about resource hoarding in New York City public schools.
One of his siblings was accepted to...
At one point, a shouting match broke out between sign-holding parents rallying on the steps of the Department of Education and a small handful of protesters. The larger group came to Tweed Hall demanding the city preserve and expand gifted and talented programs, which provide accelerated learning classrooms to about 4% of incoming kindergarten students.
It will be a very sad thing that if it gets discontinued.
Kathy Liu has an older daughter in a gifted and talented program and says she came here to fight for her two younger children to one day have the same opportunity.
And we really see the benefits of this program. It needs to go on.
But in the final days of his administration, Mayor de Blasio is proposing to end gifted and talented beginning next year. Anyone in the program would stay, but no new classrooms would be created. He instead wants to get rid of all testing of 4-year-olds, which has already gone by the wayside during the pandemic, and give accelerated coursework to every advanced student in every classroom without separating anyone.
None of the students will get the tailored instructions and services they need to thrive when teachers are stretched to the breaking point.
Earlier this week, the mayor defended his plan, saying there would be more training, more teachers, and all of this would be more fair and offer more opportunity to a greater number of students. Asamia Diaby, one of the counter-protesters, agrees.
These group of parents, they claim to be for equity, but really they're for hoarding resources directly for their children and nobody else.
At the core of the debate is who's in and who's out. In a school system that's mostly African American and Hispanic students, mostly white and Asian students get gifted and talented slots.
We need resources for all students at all academic levels who have all different needs.
And both major candidates running for mayor who essentially would have to enact this plan have said they want to expand gifted and talented programs, not get rid of it. In fact, Eric Adams, the Democrat, longtime de Blasio ally, was pressed on this directly earlier this week, and he was very non-committal about anything that the mayor is proposing right now. Live on the Lower East Side, Henry Rossoff, Pix 11 News.
The implementation question is certainly an interesting one. De Blasio is a lame duck at this point, and this is a massive structural change he is proposing, yet we don't have much in the way of details. A spokesperson for Eric Adams said he will assess the plan and reserves his right to implement policies based on the needs of students and parents should he become mayor. Supposedly, G&T is going to be phased out and Brilliant NYC is going to be phased in. So far, the DOE is promising training for kindergarten teachers, and I'm extrapolating that the plan would involve training for first grade teachers the year after, and so on, until next year's cohort of kindergartners are seniors in high school, at which point G&T will be no more and Brilliant NYC will be fully implemented. None of that has been promised yet, though, as all Chancellor Porter has said thus far is that the city will be investing in training for its 4,000 kindergarten teachers so that they can create rich learning environments in their classrooms and multiple instructional levels. Here's the thing with that, though. Teachers are already trained to differentiate. Many of us already do a pretty good job of differentiating, but there is a limit to what is possible in a classroom with one teacher and 25 to 32 children. Ideally, it would be possible to teach into 25 to 32 different learning needs. But I think even on the best day, the best teachers are addressing somewhere in the ballpark of 5 to 10 different learning needs. This is an editorial take on my part, obviously, and I'm totally open to an opposing view on this, but I have yet to encounter a training that can help to reconcile the contradictions between a philosophy of teaching to one individual learner's needs and the reality of loading 25 to 32 children into a classroom with one teacher. Unless Brilliant NYC can address these contradictions, it will not be an expansion of gifted and talented programming instruction throughout the DOE. It might be something, but it won't be that. It is difficult to assess the finer points of the Brilliant NYC plan because it is thus far shrouded in mystery. According to the mayor, the city will be soliciting community input for the next 2 months as they solidify the plan. Whether that means making tweaks to an already established plan or making things up as they go is unclear. But if any of the plans of the past year and a half are indicators, Brilliant NYC could very well be an empty Google Doc on a DOE Chromebook waiting to be populated by someone who is working from home at the moment. And now, for this week's news update. 1 in 5 of the COVID cases confirmed in New York City on Tuesday, October 12th, was from a New York City public school. Further, about 1% of New York City public school teachers, all vaccinated at this point, mind you, have gotten COVID in the past month of schools being open. The UFT Delegate Assembly on October 13th seems to have been something of a shit show, with the DA voting to endorse pro-charter school, former cop, landlord, and New Jerseyite Eric Adams as mayor. He is the presumptive winner as the Democratic nominee, so this is likely a meaningless kissing of the ring by our union in a school year in which we will have to negotiate a new contract. Nonetheless, a lot of teachers must have read this news and wondered if there was any real point to making an endorsement to begin with if it ends up going in the end to the one candidate least invested in your union's best interests. Speaking of the union's best interests, there was a question at the Delegate Assembly about the New York Health Act that Mulgrew dismissed completely out of hand, suggesting that it would be costly for the union. Anybody who has read up on the New York Health Act, of course, recognizes that it would basically provide commensurate health care to what we have now as teachers, but for everybody and for free. It's a state-sponsored single-payer healthcare plan for the state of New York. We'll do a healthcare episode in the future, or maybe even a series of episodes, but for now, it's worth noting that the UFT has used political advocacy funding to run ads against the New York Health Act, and really the only strategic reason for a union to oppose the New York Health Act is if that union is concerned that it might lose some of its leverage in providing or facilitating healthcare for its membership. Like I said, we'll get back to this in a future episode, but just imagine how many floors of the UFT building downtown are devoted to healthcare. With the New York Health Act, those floors would be rendered useless, or better yet, devoted towards something otherwise useful. Probably something a little out of the wheelhouse for the UFT though, like meaningful demands and real follow-through. As we wrap up episode 12 of Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast, I want to take a moment, as always, to thank you, the listener, for tuning in. We are approaching 400 listens. We might have already reached that number by the time you hear this, which is really exciting for such a niche show. And the goal is to keep growing. If you like what you're hearing, Tell your colleagues and friends to have a listen. Be sure to tune in next week, too, for a Patreon exclusive episode with my friend Craig. He's a special guest who teaches music at a gifted and talented school in Lower Manhattan. So we'll get the scoop from him on what gifted and talented programming is like on the inside and how things might change now that the program is being phased out. You'll be able to find that episode at patreon.com/professional development. Thanks again, and catch you next time.